So, in case you're new to Elden Ring, or if you just never jumped down the tutorial hole, guard counters are one of the two things that Miyazaki gave the John Dark Souls 3's kit. Expect him to fight Sekiro bosses. You can perform them by first blocking an attack and then pressing R2. Pretty easy, right? Them being so simple, you'd think that they would be a beginner-friendly tool, right? Wrong! Despite seeming good on paper, the viability of guard counters depends heavily on what enemies you're fighting and ultimately make using them more of a chore than a rewarding defensive option. I've just finished a playthrough of Elden Ring where I utilized guard counters so I could try and pinpoint exactly why no one really uses them, despite shields being as good as they are in Elden Ring. I'm gonna split this video into 3 loose sections based on how guard counters are effective against normal enemies, bosses, and a PvP, in order to look at a potential way to fix them. Before we get into why guard counters are a problem, we first need to see the niche that they fall into now. Guard counters deal high stance damage that is comparable to a charged heavy attack, while also being faster, so they're mostly used as stance break enemies, but they don't have hyper armor, so they can only be used if either your shield is hard enough to make weapons bounce off at the end of an enemy's attack chain, or in the middle of attack chain if they have a delayed hit. Basically, in most situations, they're just a faster charge heavy. They can only be used at the end of an attack chain. I'm not going to act like guard counters are useless because, well, they're not, but I can't help but feel like they don't serve the purpose that they're meant to. Because the accessibility of guard counters, what with them being able to be used with any shield weapon combination, or if you just want to block with your weapon, feels like they were meant to be versatile and a beginner-friendly tool. But the opposite is true in-game, due to having to know the intricacies of an opponent's moveset ahead of time, and not get stunned by them sneezing on you mid-combo. Normal enemies are usually staggered or even flat-out stance broken by guard counters, making them seem like a very useful tool. Since they don't have hyper armor, they're relegated to only be used on single enemies or very slow enemies. Guard counters work especially well against small enemies like dogs, against birds, and against really slow enemies like omens. Anything in between have varying levels of success, due to even the most basic enemies having deceptively long attack chains, forcing you to wait until the end of their chain and hope that they don't have any extensions that would hit you. Generally speaking, in most scenarios, it'd be better just to R1 in order to avoid the interaction entirely, or just roll out of range and punish with a charge heavy instead. Basically, against normal enemies, guard counters are not very viable due to a lack of hyper armor. They still find specific uses against very small or very slow enemies. For bosses though, they seem to have a completely different niche. For this point, I'm gonna need to explain a watered down version of how stance works in Elden Ring. Basically, an enemy or a boss's specific amount of stance, when broken, will cause them to stagger and usually nets a critical hit. When a boss takes stance damage, you not start regenerating until about 5 seconds after you hit them. Again, the number varies, but after the boss rapidly starts regenerating stance. An example of this would be Morgott. His 80 stance, after 6 seconds, starts gaining 15 stance back a second. What this means practically is that you want to perform as much stance damage as possible in a short time frame, or else you'll just be put back to square one. This is where guard counters come in. The extremely high stance damage of guard counters allows you to trade hits with bosses mid-chain in order to break their stance faster due to the sheer amount of delayed attacks in Elden Ring's bosses. This comes in handy for bosses like Morgott that have long strings of attacks and like to jump away from you. You could also guard counter at the end of a boss's attack strings if you don't want to trade damage, but at that point you may as well just roll and use a charged heavy because there's more boosting items for charged heavies that would ultimately make them more viable. Because most bosses, guard counters are relatively strong if you don't mind trading damage though. I'm not going to talk about PvP much because I don't think guard counters were really designed for it, but I did want to talk about it a little bit because I feel like speeding up guard counters would not be a good idea. Mainly because of PvP. The recoil animation is already way too long, and anything faster would probably make it guaranteed damage. And I don't really want to make guaranteed damage on blocking an idea, because shield's already kind of pretty cracked in PvP. The only thing that I would really propose would be maybe making more forward tracking, and that's about it. Now, people don't really discuss guard counters all that much, but I looked up what people thought about them on a Steam message board in the wiki, and people seem to not realize that just because something functions the way it does in game, does not mean that that is the way it was meant to be. The general consensus is that in order to make guard counters viable, you need to have very specific high poise armor and specifically use great shields because that's the best way to do it in game. But the problem is that you can do guard counters with any shield and you can have any armor, so limiting its accessibility to someone only in full bull goats in the fingerprint shield seems to go against that idea. Some possible solutions to make guard counters more viable would be just to add hyper armor to them. If this lightning fast shit stick of a weapon class that is great swords can have hyper armor just to piss me off in Dark Souls 3 PvP, then we can give this slow ass animation that has a sound effect and a motion line some hyper armor, for fuck's sake. If From Software wanted to make them even a little viable late game, they might even add some damage resistance during the attack, similar to the inverse of what they do with thrusting resistance already during normal attacks. Another possible solution would be just to have the player's guard up during the attack, like with shield pokes and thrusting weapons, though I feel like that would make them too strong in PvP. If someone has a great shield, it just uses barricade shield, and I don't want to make shield pokes any stronger than they already are. As a quick side note, the hitbox of some weapons and guard counters could extend a little bit lower because they just straight up miss against dogs or imps, but that's more of a quality of life change. And just because I feel obligated, here's a table I found on Reddit for stance damages and speeds of guard counters.